Welcome to the third lesson of this course. In Lesson 3, we will be discussing the structure, properties and chemistry of the organic functional groups known as alkenes and alkynes. As we discussed in the first lesson, alkenes and alkynes are hydrocarbons that contain double and triple bonds respectively. In other words, alkenes and alkynes are both examples of unsaturated hydrocarbons. As we will see in this lesson, this unsaturation means that both of these functional groups are capable of undergoing many different reactions, making them incredibly useful and important functional groups, with roles in biology, industry, and organic synthesis. Lesson 3 is divided into 4 parts. In the first part of Lesson 3, we will examine the structure and nomenclature of alkenes, concluding with an examination of stereoisomerism in alkenes. In parts 2 and 3, we will look at alkenes' reactivity in the context of addition reactions. We will look at several of these reactions in detail, learning about the conditions, products, and mechanisms involved. Finally, in part 4, we will look at the structure and reactions of alkynes, focusing on a few key examples. Ready to get started? Perfect. Let's go to the next page and get started learning about the structure and properties of alkenes. As mentioned, alkenes and alkynes are organic hydrocarbons that contain double and triple bonds respectively. We are going to look in detail at the atomic and hybrid orbitals that are involved in carbon-carbon double and triple bonds shortly. But recall from our earlier lessons that a carbon-carbon double bond consists of one sigma and one pi bond. The double bond creates a trigonal planar geometry, with bond angles of approximately 120 degrees. The double bond also restricts the free rotation of atoms. This restriction means that alkenes are capable of having stereoisomers, based on the sides where substituent groups are attached. Because the carbon atoms can't freely rotate, groups can be stuck together on the same side of the double bond. As we saw in cycloalkanes, when two groups are attached on the same side of a bond, specifically a bond that can't rotate, the stereoisomer is referred to as cis. Two groups can also be attached on opposite sides, giving a completely different type of stereoisomer called trans. What about the structure of alkynes? The triple bond in an alkyne has a linear geometry, with bond angles of 180 degrees. Notice that when we draw alkynes in skeletal form, we need to maintain this linearity by keeping the carbon atoms of the triple bond in a single line. Make sure you don't forget the two carbon atoms of the CC triple bond. It is easy to leave one of these carbon atoms off, accidentally, because the triple bond does not zigzag as it does in the structures of other types of hydrocarbons. Both of these functional groups are unsaturated hydrocarbons, which means they are capable of undergoing reactions that add additional atoms, or groups of atoms, to the double and triple bonds in their structure. This is the basis for the types of reactions we will look at first, which are called addition reactions. Before we look at these reactions, however, let's look at the occurrence of alkenes and alkynes in nature, and then examine their nomenclature. Alkenes occur throughout nature and are found in a wide variety of biological systems, materials, and pharmaceutical products. For example, alkenes are frequently found as various natural products in plants and other organisms as secondary metabolites. Several examples are shown below. Secondary metabolites are organic compounds produced by organisms that are not directly involved in the normal growth, development, or reproduction of the organism. Unlike primary metabolites, which are essential for basic cellular functions, such as energy production and biosynthesis, secondary metabolites often serve specialized roles. For example, the molecule alpha-pinene is a type of secondary metabolite, one that contains an alkene, that is produced by many coniferous trees, such as pine and spruce trees, and many shrubs, such as rosemary. Alpha-pinene acts as a chemical defense against herbivores. Its strong aroma and bitter taste can deter insects and other animals from feeding on the plant. Alpha-pinene has antimicrobial properties that protect plants from pathogens, including bacteria and fungi. This helps to prevent infections and diseases. Plants can increase the production of alpha-pinene in response to environmental stress, such as physical damage or drought. This helps in the repair process and provides additional protection against microbial invasion. Secondary metabolites can also provide the ability to attract, rather than deter, other organisms. Fragrances and colors of flowers and fruits are often due to secondary metabolites, and many of these have at least one CC double bond. The compound geraniol, for example, is an alkene containing terpenoid that is produced in many varieties of flowers, and is used to help attract pollinators so that the flower can more readily reproduce. In all of these cases and others, the presence of the alkene functional group imparts physical and chemical properties to these secondary metabolites that are important in their function and biosynthesis. We can also learn how to use the alkene functional group in our own chemical reactions, so that we can develop other interesting molecules that might have properties we need to fight disease or alter the performance of a material we are trying to create. Alkenes are also important precursors in the chemical industry. The two most important industrial alkenes, ethylene and propylene, are formed from cracking petroleum. Petroleum cracking is a chemical process used in the refining of crude oil to break down large complex hydrocarbon molecules into simpler, lighter molecules. This process increases the yield of valuable products like ethylene. Each year, over 200 billion pounds of ethylene and 70 billion pounds of propylene are produced globally and used to make many compounds, including those shown in the image below. Now that we have looked at some of the important roles and uses of alkenes, let's go to the next page and learn how to name and identify alkenes. Recall that naming an alkane, or an alkyl halide, requires 3 discrete steps. Alkenes are named using the same steps, with the following additional guidelines. First, as before, we need to identify the parent chain. For alkenes, we follow the same procedure, with the caveat that the parent chain must contain the CC double bond. As an example of this process, consider the following structure. When trying to identify the parent chain, notice that there is a 6-carbon segment running horizontally through the top of the molecule. We can also identify another 6-carbon parent chain that runs through the lower part of the molecule. There are actually 2 6-carbon pathways we can take through this part of the molecule, but notice that they have the same number and type of substituents, and are therefore identical in their outcome. Which of these pathways represents the parent chain for this compound? That's right, we need to use the pathway that contains the CC double bond. Even if the pathway that contains the double bond has fewer carbon atoms, that would still be the parent chain because the alkene functional group is now the defining feature of the compound, and the parent chain must contain this part of the structure. Our next step is to number the parent chain. When numbering the parent chain of an alkene, the pi bond should receive the lowest number possible, despite the presence of alkyl substituents. Looking at the first numbering example, we assign the location number 1 to the terminal carbon atom, where the double bond starts, and the number 2 to the second carbon atom of the double bond. We then proceed to number the remaining carbon atoms in the chain. On the next example, notice that we have a bromo substituent. If the parent chain did not contain a double bond, we would start numbering at the end closest to this substituent. Because this molecule is an alkene, however, we have a different procedure. For alkenes, we need to assign the lowest number possible to the carbon atoms of the pi bond. For this example, that means we would start numbering at the terminal carbon atom again, as that is where the pi bond is located. The bromine atom, therefore, is assigned the location number 4. A third example in this series also has a bromo substituent, but this time it is connected to a terminal carbon atom on the parent chain. We also see that the pi bond is not at a terminal atom. Rather, it is an internal double bond. Where should we start numbering the parent chain? That's right, we still need to give the pi bond the lowest possible location numbers. If we started numbering at the carbon with the bromine atom, the double bond would start at carbon 3. If we start numbering at the other end of the chain, closer to the double bond, we can assign the location number 2 to the first carbon atom of the pi bond. This is preferred because it is the lowest possible location value. This numbering scheme, where the double bond is assigned the location number 2, is correct, as it gives the lower location number value to the CC double bond, despite the bromine atom being assigned a higher location value. The alkene location takes priority over the halogen substituent. The last step in our naming process is to list out our substituents and assemble the name. As before, we will list our substituents in the name we assign, in alphabetical order, not numerical. We will also include the multiple bond index as the suffix to the name. Recall that for alkenes we use the -ene suffix. Note that because the double bond has the potential to be located at multiple locations in a structure, we need to specify this location in the name. We can do this by including the location number in the name, specifying the location where the pi bond begins. We write this location number just before the parent name for the compound. For example, the structure shown here, which has no substituents, has a parent chain that is 5 carbon atoms long, and so it is assigned the parent name, pent. Because it has a CC double bond, we use the suffix -ene to specify the functional group alkene is present. The location where the pi bond begins is carbon atom 1. We need to include that location in the name. If we write the name as 1-pentene, this explicitly states that the pi bond starts on the first carbon and connects to the second carbon. As a side note, it is also possible to place the location identifier just before the -ene suffix. If we followed this method, the name we would write is pent-1-ene. Let's try the next example. In this structure we can see that the parent chain is also named as pent, and that we have a methyl group substituent, located at carbon atom 3. The double bond begins at carbon atom 1. The final name for the compound, therefore, is 3-methyl-1-pentene. Alternatively, we could also write 3-methyl-pent-1-ene. The third example, shown next, has a parent chain that is 6 carbon atoms in length. The parent name, therefore, is hex. We now assign location numbers along the chain, ensuring that we assign the double bond the lowest number possible. Now that we have numbered the parent chain, let's make a list of our substituents and their locations. We see there is a methyl group located at carbon atom 2 along the parent chain, as well as an ethyl group at carbon atom 3. We also see that the double bond begins at carbon 2, so we have a 2-ene. How do we assemble all of this into a name? Let's start by listing the substituents in alphabetical order, including each substituent's location number. Starting in this way, our name should begin with 3-ethyl followed by 2-methyl. Now we need to write the parent name, but we also need to include the location of the alkene double bond, which occurs at carbon 2. We can do this by writing 2-hexene, or we can write hex-2-ene. So the complete name is 3-ethyl 2-methyl 2-hexene. Now that we have learned how to handle the essential nomenclature for alkenes, let's take a look at what we do when there are multiple carbon-carbon double bonds in a compound. When a compound has more than one carbon-carbon double bond, we need to include two additional pieces of information in our name. We need to include the location of each of the pi bonds. We do that by including each of their location numbers before the parent chain, making sure to separate each number from the next using a comma. We also need to modify the suffix to indicate the quantity of pi bonds, using the numeric prefixes di, tri, tetra, etc. If we have two pi bonds, for example, the suffix becomes diene. If 3 were in the structure, we would use triene as the suffix. The first molecule, for example, would be named 1,3-butadiene. The numbers 1 and the 3 indicate the starting locations for the two double bonds. The parent chain has 4 carbon atoms, which is why we use but as the parent name. Finally, we have 2 carbon-carbon double bonds. This is why we use diene as the suffix. Notice that we have inserted the letter A between the but prefix and the diene suffix. This is done so that we don't have two consonants next to each other in the name. Butadiene is easier to pronounce than butadiene. In the second example, we have to be careful to note that we are dealing with a cyclic parent chain. Because there are 6 atoms in the ring, we can use the parent name cyclohex. There are 2 double bonds in the structure, meaning we need to use the diene suffix again. Our last task is to indicate the starting location of each of the double bonds. If we start our numbering at one of the pi bonds, and continue numbering around the ring, we see that the second pi bond starts at carbon 4. We can attach these location numbers to the beginning of the name, before the parent chain, to give a final name of 1,4-cyclohexadiene. Let's turn our attention now to the last example. Here, the parent chain has 6 carbon atoms as well, but the compound is acyclic, so we use the parent name prefix, hex. We see there are 3 carbon-carbon double bonds, starting at carbons 1, 3, and 5 respectively. The complete name for this structure, therefore, is 1,3,5 hexatriene. Now that we have completed our introduction to the nomenclature of alkenes, we can turn our attention towards their structure, with a particular emphasis on the pi bond and the hybridization of atomic orbitals involved. To understand the chemistry of alkenes, we need to look a little closer at their structure, and in particular, study the form of the covalent bonds that comprise the double bond. As we have seen, the 2 carbon atoms of the CC double bond within an alkene are known to have a trigonal planar geometry. This geometry places the 4 bonds of the alkene carbon, and the attached atoms, all within the same plane, with a 120 degrees bond angle. We can see this geometry represented in the simplest possible alkene, ethene, which is shown in the diagram below. A satisfactory model for explaining this geometry can be achieved by the mathematical maneuver of hybridizing the s and p orbitals of each alkene carbon atom. When we did this procedure earlier, to explain the bonding in methane, we hybridized the s orbital and all 3 p orbitals to produce 4 equivalent sp3 hybrid orbitals. However, in the case of ethylene, each carbon atom only needs to form bonds with 3 atoms, not 4. Therefore, each carbon atom only needs 3 hybridized orbitals. So in this case we will mathematically average the s orbital with only 2 of the 3 p orbitals. The remaining p orbital will remain unaffected by our mathematical procedure. We can call this the unhybridized p orbital. What do the sp2 hybrid orbitals look like? Let's go to the next page and see. The result of the hybridization, in which we combine one s orbital with 2 out of 3 p orbitals, is a carbon atom with 3 total sp2 hybridized orbitals. The nucleus of the carbon atom is located at the center of these orbitals, and the mathematical output of this operation shows that these orbitals would all be oriented at angles of 120 degrees from each other, which is what we observe in molecules like ethene. Additionally, the atom has a single unhybridized p orbital sitting on an axis that is 90 degrees in orientation relative to the sp2 orbitals. We can see a depiction of the orbitals in the diagram shown below. In this diagram, the unhybridized p orbital lobes are shown in red and blue, and the sp2 hybrid orbitals are shown in gray. For clarity, only the front lobe of each hybridized orbital is shown. Note that these are called sp2 hybridized orbitals, to indicate that they were obtained by averaging one s orbital and two p orbitals. While this is the description of how a single carbon atom can have bonds oriented in a trigonal planar orientation, it does not show how an alkene, like ethene, is constructed. Let's take a look at how that is possible on the next page. To understand how the double bond in alkenes are formed, we can use ethene, the simplest possible alkene, as an example. Looking at the diagram below, notice that each of the carbon atoms in ethene is sp2 hybridized. Because of this, each of those carbon atoms has 3 sp2 hybridized orbitals available to form sigma bonds by end-to-end overlap of orbitals. One sigma bond forms between the two carbon atoms, and then each carbon atom also forms a sigma bond with each of its neighboring hydrogen atoms. In addition to the hybrid orbitals, each carbon atom has one p orbital, as is shown in the diagram with blue and red lobes. These p orbitals also form a type of covalent bond by interacting with one another. Let's take a look at how that works on the next page. As mentioned, the unhybridized p orbitals present on each carbon atom can overlap with each other as well, but not end-to-end, as is the case in sigma bonding. When two p orbitals, like those shown here, form a bond, they do so by a side-to-side overlap. This is a separate bonding interaction called a pi bond. Do not be confused by the nature of this type of bond, due to the colors or shading of the orbitals. It is true that the pi overlap occurs in two places, above the plane of the molecule, in red, and below the plane, in blue. Nevertheless, these two regions of overlap represent only one interaction called a pi bond. Pi bonds have several distinctive properties that significantly influence the behavior of molecules containing them, particularly in alkenes. For example, pi bonds are generally weaker than sigma bonds, because the side-by-side overlap of p orbitals in a pi bond is less effective, due to a smaller region of overlap, than the head-on overlap in a sigma bond. This weakness makes pi bonds more reactive. We can take advantage of this. Also related to their reactivity is the distribution of electron density in a pi bond. The electron density in a pi bond is concentrated above and below the plane of the bonded atoms. This distribution makes the pi bond more accessible to reactive species. This is another factor we will take advantage of. Structurally, the presence of a pi bond restricts rotation around the double bond, as rotation would require breaking the pi bond. This would require significant amounts of energy. This means that at room temperature, rotation of the atoms around this bond does not occur. This restricted rotation leads to the possibility for having cis and trans isomers when a double bond is present. To understand this phenomenon, it would be helpful to see a few examples. Let's go to the next page and have a look. In the two example structures shown below, we see that the two alkenes have the same composition and connectivity of atoms, but the arrangement of the atoms, geometrically, is different. In the example on the left, we can see that the two methyl groups are on the same side of the double bond, placing them next to each other in space. This is called the cis isomer. Compare with the trans isomer, which is shown on the right. In the trans isomer, the two methyl groups are on opposite sides of the double bond. Notice that because of the pi bond, which imparts a restriction on the free rotation of the atoms around the double bond, the cis isomer cannot freely convert into the trans isomer, or vice versa. This means that these two compounds are different from each other. A chemical change, not a physical change, would be required to convert one into the other. That concludes the first part of Lesson 3. In the next lesson, we will continue our discussion of alkenes, this time shifting our focus to their chemistry and reactions.